In this section, we're going to take a look at input groups. Input groups are a type of component that allow us to give us some additional styling to each of our input elements within a form. And it's worth pointing out that we're not going to cover all the different types of input groups that we have at our disposal to use in forms, but we are going to cover some of the more popular ones. So I would encourage you to also take a look at the Bootstrap documentation to see what additional input groups are available. But for starters, we have this form that should look familiar from the Bootstrap CSS section. We have this form element, and then within it we have this div element with a class of form group, and nested inside that we have a form control that has this placeholder of Twitter handle. Now my question is, wouldn't it be cool if we could actually add a little @ symbol before this Twitter handle input element to kind of indicate that that's what we're looking for? And of course I would argue, yes, that would be cool, and it's exactly what input groups allow us to do in Bootstrap. The way we do it is by adding a input group div around our input element. So we nest our input element within this div class, or within this div that has a class of input group, and then within that we add an input group add-on. And in this case, the add-on that we want to add is simply this @ symbol before our input element. We can see that the input group component follows a similar pattern to the form group itself. For instance, in the form group, we have this div element with the class form group and then a form control within that form group. With input groups, we have a div with a class input group and then an input group add-on nested within that via a span element. So hopefully this pattern is somewhat intuitive now that we're already familiar with form groups. Although I understand this is a little bit ambiguous for now, so it's best that we go to our browser to see exactly what the result is. We'll begin by observing what our form control looks like without our input group add-on, and then we'll refresh our browser to juxtapose this. And we observe that our input group add-on is this nicely styled box that's seamlessly placed next to our form control. Now let's see what additional input group add-ons we can place next to our form controls. We just saw how we could add symbols as input group add-ons. These are things like text or even glyph icons. Moving forward, let's now take a look at how we might be able to add buttons as input groups. So I'm going to go ahead and replace this input group with a different input group. And this input group still has a type of text as its input, as its form control. And in this case, we just simply replace the Twitter handle with a search placeholder. We'll also notice that we move the span element that contains our input group element after our input element itself. This is totally fine. Input group add-ons and buttons can be before or after our input element. And speaking of input group buttons, notice that we replaced our input group add-on class with an input group button class. Whenever we use buttons, that's what we need to do, is use the input group button class within our input group rather than the add-on class. From there, we just add buttons as we normally would. Let's go back to our browser to see exactly how this looks. And it looks like this. First we have our form control that's a text input, and then after that we have this button, our Go button, that's seamlessly placed next to our form control. Finally, let's go back to our text editor and add a drop-down button right next to this Go button. To add another button to our input group, we're going to start by adding another div element with the input group button class assigned to it. Then, rather than adding a simple button like this one, we know we want to add a drop-down button, so we're going to include the elements that we need to add for our drop-down, beginning with our button and including in addition to it our unordered list. We should understand how drop-downs work by now, and by seeing it here in this input group, we've learned two things. Number one, that we can use a drop-down as an input group, and number two, that we can have multiple buttons within a single input group element. Let's go back to our browser to see how this looks. And it looks as we might expect. We still have our form control, which is a text input. We still have our Go button that we created previously, and now we have this drop-down button that we just created and is positioned exactly right next to it.